My name is Hazel. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been defined by steadiness. Someone dependable, reasonable, calm. I work with people, solve problems quietly, and I've learned how to carry responsibility without announcing it. If you ask those who know me casually, they might say I'm nice, maybe even predictable, the kind of woman who listens more than she speaks, the kind who doesn't make scenes. That perception has followed me everywhere, including into my marriage. I'm sharing the story not because it's dramatic, but because it's honest. And because there's a kind of ending that doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, invisibly, in ordinary rooms, during ordinary days. This is the story of how I realized my marriage ended long before the divorce, and how I was the only one still trying. If you're expecting revenge, shouting matches, or some cinematic moment where everything explodes, this won't be that. What happened to me was quieter, more unsettling, the kind of shift that only makes sense in hindsight, when you line up years of small moments and finally see the pattern they form. For a long time, I believed endurance was love, that patience could compensate for the imbalance, that if I stayed kind, stayed understanding, stayed available, things would eventually right themselves. I didn't think of myself as weak. I thought I was mature, loyal, committed. What I didn't understand then was how easily loyalty can turn into invisibility when it isn't met halfway. This story isn't about vilifying another person. It's about tracing my own internal timeline. When I began shrinking, when I began noticing, and when something inside me quietly refused to disappear any further. There are no heroes or villains here, just two people moving at different speeds toward very different truths. You'll hear about moments that seemed insignificant at the time, conversations that ended a little too quickly, decisions that were made without me, but affected me deeply. You'll hear about silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that fills a room when effort becomes one-sided. Most of all, you'll hear about restraint, about choosing not to react immediately, about learning that power doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like observation, like preparation, like letting clarity replace hope. I'm telling this story now because I know I'm not the only one who has lived it. Many of us are taught to keep going, to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one. We're praised for how much we can carry without complaint. But rarely are we taught how to recognize the moment when carrying everything means losing ourselves. This isn't a warning, it's a reflection, a record of what it feels like to wake up one day and realize the ending already happened. You just hadn't caught up to it yet. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever stayed in something longer than it was staying with you? In the beginning, I was easy to define. For them, I was the reliable one, the steady presence, the woman who remembered birthdays, deadlines, quiet preferences. I was the one who made things smoother without being asked. If there was tension in a room, I absorbed it. If something needed fixing, I handled it before it became visible. People described me as low maintenance, and they meant it as a compliment. In my marriage, that role intensified. To my husband, I was competence without friction. I was emotional availability without demand. I was support that didn't ask for spotlight or reciprocity. I don't think he consciously decided this about me. It happened gradually, the way labels always do. Through repetition, through what goes unchallenged. I became the woman who was fine with last-minute changes, fine with being spoken for, fine with plans that didn't include my input. Not because I truly was, but because I didn't make discomfort visible. When friends talked about marriage struggles, they often looked at us as an exception. You two are so solid, they'd say, so calm. What they were really seeing was my ability to keep things running without noise. Stability mistaken for mutuality. Inside our home, my presence was functional. Appreciated, yes, but in the way infrastructure is appreciated. You don't notice it unless it fails. I handled logistics. I tracked finances. I remembered which conversations had already happened and which hadn't. I adjusted my expectations quietly. Over time, I learned which topics landed and which ones dissolved into polite dismissal. I learned when to speak briefly, when to soften my tone, when to wait. And eventually, I learned how to disappear just enough to keep the peace. The strange thing is, I wasn't unhappy all the time. That's what made it harder to name. There were good days, laughing days, shared routines that felt comforting, but underneath them was a consistent imbalance that I couldn't quite articulate back then. Effort flowed in one direction more than the other. When something mattered to him, it was addressed. When something mattered to me, it was acknowledged, then postponed, or reframed, or gently minimized until I questioned whether it really mattered at all. I was seen as strong, so my needs were treated as optional. I was seen as understanding, so my disappointment was absorbed without consequence. I was seen as capable, so my exhaustion went unnoticed. What no one seemed to register, not even me at first, was how much internal negotiation it took to maintain that version of myself. How often I revised my own reactions before they reached the surface. How many times have I chosen, "this isn't worth it," over "this is important to me"? In conversations, I became concise, careful. I brought up issues with solutions already prepared, as if preemptively justifying my right to speak. Even then, I noticed how quickly the attention drifted once my usefulness was extracted. I wasn't ignored. I was relied on. And that distinction matters, because being ignored hurts loudly. Being relied on without regard erodes you quietly. Over time, I internalized the idea that my value lay in my consistency, not my presence. That love was demonstrated through what I provided, not how I was met. I told myself this was adulthood, compromise, emotional maturity. But there was a cost. I stopped expecting curiosity. I stopped expecting initiative. I stopped expecting to be chosen when it required effort. I didn't dramatize this realization. I didn't announce it. I carried it the way I carried everything else, privately, responsibly, without urgency. To them, I was the calm center. To myself, I was becoming increasingly peripheral. And the most unsettling part was this. No one asked if I was okay with that role. Because I played it so well, it seemed permanent, almost natural. Looking back, this is where the story really begins. Not with conflict, but with definition. The moment I realized I was being seen clearly, just not fully. I was useful, I was trusted, I was stable, but I was no longer encountered. And I didn't yet know what that absence would eventually cost all of us. The first time it happened, it didn't register as harm. That's important to say, because if it had been obvious, I would have named it. I would have addressed it. I've never been someone who confuses silence with fear. What I confuse it with is discernment. And at the time, this felt too small to deserve attention. We were at a dinner with friends, nothing formal. One of those evenings that moves easily from laughter to half-serious conversation. Someone asked a question about a decision my husband and I had made together, or at least, a decision I believed we had made together. Before I could answer, he did. Not maliciously, not sharply, just confidently, as if the answer belonged to him alone. He told the story smoothly, with details that weren't wrong, but weren't complete either. He framed the choice as something he had concluded, something I had agreed with afterward. I sat there nodding lightly, aware of a subtle misalignment forming in the room. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. No one reacted. No one noticed. And why would they? From the outside, it sounded reasonable, cooperative, normal. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't anger, it wasn't embarrassment. It was the quiet awareness of being edited out in real time. I told myself it wasn't intentional, that he was just better at speaking on the spot, that I didn't need to correct the narrative over something so minor, so I smiled. I let it pass. I continued the evening. Later that night, alone with my thoughts, I replayed the moment, not obsessively, just once. Enough to confirm that what bothered me wasn't the inaccuracy, but the ease with which my presence had been bypassed. What struck me was how natural it felt to him, as if this version of the story had already settled in his mind. I considered mentioning it. The words even formed. "Hey, earlier when you said, but they felt disproportionate, petty." I imagined the response before it happened. A casual apology, a shrug. I didn't mean anything by it, and that would have been true. But intention wasn't the point. Pattern was. At the time, though, I wasn't tracking patterns. I was tracking harmony. So I chose quiet. That decision, to stay silent, to preserve ease, became the template. Small moments followed. A plan was mentioned as if it were already decided. A schedule adjusted without discussion. A preference was stated on my behalf. Each one is individually dismissible, collectively significant. Still, I didn't react, I adapted. I began clarifying less and listening more. I noticed how often conversations moved forward without pausing for my input. How rarely did anyone check if my version aligned. I wasn't being silenced. I was being assumed. And the assumption is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It slips into the space where curiosity used to live. I remember thinking, This is what long-term relationships look like. You don't need to consult each other about everything. That's what I told myself. But something about that first moment stayed with me, not as a grievance, but as a marker. The first place where I felt slightly unanchored, like my role in my own life had shifted just a few inches to the side. No one else noticed the cut. There was no blood, no scar, but I did. And that awareness didn't make me louder. It made me more observant. I started noticing how often my contributions were summarized by someone else, how decisions were framed after the fact, how my agreement was assumed rather than requested. And still I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid to speak, but because I was measuring something I didn't yet have language for, testing whether this was an anomaly or an early signal. At the time, I didn't know this was the beginning of distance. I thought it was just an awkward moment, already resolved by my restraint. But looking back now, I can see it clearly. That was the first small cut, and it healed over just enough for the damage to continue unseen. What followed wasn't escalation, it was repetition. That's what made it dangerous. Disrespect rarely announces itself as cruelty. More often, it arrives dressed as familiarity, as efficiency, as confidence. And because I understood that, I kept giving the benefit of the doubt, long after doubt itself had quietly moved in. The moments began stacking. He'd answer questions directed at both of us without turning to look at me. He'd make plans assuming my availability, my agreement, and my flexibility. He'd recount shared experiences with himself at the center, and me as supporting context, present but secondary. None of it was overt. None of it was shouted. And that was the problem. Because it allowed me to normalize it. I told myself I was being too sensitive, that long relationships naturally blur individual edges, that not every slight deserved dissection. I reminded myself of his good qualities, of the ways he showed care that didn't involve conversation. I became an internal negotiator, constantly balancing what I felt against what I could logically excuse. And slowly, my silence became predictable. Predictability changes how people treat you. Once someone learns you won't interrupt, they stop pausing. Once they learn you won't challenge framing, they begin editing freely. Once they learn your discomfort stays internal, they stop noticing it altogether. I watched this happen in real time and still struggled to name it. There were moments when I almost spoke up. A sentence would rise, fully formed, and then dissolve under the weight of timing. Not now, not worth it. This will pass. Each time I chose quiet, I told myself I was choosing maturity. But maturity without mutuality becomes self-erasure. The truth is, I was afraid of being difficult, afraid of disrupting the image of us as steady, functional, admirable. I had invested years into being seen as reasonable. I didn't want to jeopardize that for something I couldn't yet prove was real. So I adapted further. I preempted needs, I shortened explanations, I softened language that didn't need softening. I learned how to make my presence seamless. And in doing so, I trained everyone, including him, on how little resistance to expect. The irony is, I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic sense. I wasn't crying myself to sleep. I wasn't fantasizing about escape. I was functioning, thriving even, on the surface. But something essential was being consistently deprioritized, my internal authority. I stopped trusting my reactions. I began editing my expectations before voicing them. I assumed inconvenience where there was once entitlement to care. And that shift didn't come from one big betrayal. It came from many small permissions. Each time I allowed myself to be spoken for. Each time I let my silence stand in for consent. Each time I rationalized being overlooked as love being expressed differently. I remember one moment in particular, standing in the kitchen, listening to him explain a decision that affected both of us, already finalized. He spoke casually, as if looping me in were a courtesy rather than a requirement. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because the energy required to challenge it felt disproportionate to the outcome. I already knew how the conversation would go. I would explain. He would listen just enough. He would reassure without adjusting, and we would move on. That knowledge was new and deeply unsettling, because it meant I had begun predicting my own irrelevance. The more I normalized this dynamic, the more invisible it became to everyone else. Friends saw ease, family saw stability. No one questioned why I deferred so often, or why my opinions were always delivered gently, with disclaimers attached. I was praised for my calm, but calm, when it's enforced internally, isn't peace. It's containment. And containment has a limit. I didn't reach it yet. At this stage, I was still convincing myself this was temporary, that things ebb and flow, that marriages have seasons. What I didn't realize was that this wasn't a season. It was a role being reinforced daily, And by staying quiet long enough, I had helped normalize it. It wasn't until much later that I understood this part clearly. At the time, it didn't feel like being assigned anything. It felt like slipping into a shape that had already been outlined for me. The role was simple, efficient, almost flattering on the surface. I was the dependable one, the one who would handle things without being reminded, the one who wouldn't make a situation heavier by needing too much reassurance, the one who could be counted on to adapt. In that role, my presence was valuable but not negotiable, useful but not consulted. Once I recognized it, I saw how consistently it showed up. If something went wrong, I would fix it. If something was missing, I would supply it. If something needed emotional labor, I would provide it quietly. And because I did all of this without complaint, it became expected. I wasn't asked if I could take something on. It was assumed I would. I wasn't asked how I felt about a decision. It was assumed I would understand. My flexibility became part of the infrastructure of the relationship. Reliable, invisible, taken for granted. What disturbed me wasn't just the imbalance. It was how little resistance there was when I began stepping back slightly. When I hesitated, things stalled. When I didn't preemptively smooth an interaction, tension lingered. And instead of curiosity, "Are you okay? What changed?" there was quiet confusion, even mild irritation. It became clear that my role wasn't just supportive. It was stabilizing, and stability, once depended on, becomes a silent obligation. I started noticing how rarely anyone asked what I wanted without attaching a logistical frame to it. Preferences were treated like data points, not expressions of self. Useful for planning, but not essential to honor. There was no malice in this. That's what made it so hard to challenge. Because how do you confront someone who isn't cruel, just comfortable? How do you explain that being counted on feels different when it replaces being considered? I remember thinking, if I stop doing this, everything will wobble. And the thought didn't empower me. It burdened me. So I kept the role. I told myself it was temporary. That once things settled, once stress eased, once we had more time, the balance would return. I told myself I was strong enough to carry it. But strength, when unacknowledged, doesn't feel like power. It feels like isolation. The more I fulfilled the role, the more it defined me. Conversations revolved around what I managed, not who I was. Compliments focused on reliability, not insight. I was thanked for what I did, not asked how it affected me. And slowly I realized something unsettling. No one knew how much of myself I was withholding, because the role didn't require my full presence, only my performance. I could have been replaced by a checklist, and the outcome would have looked the same. That's when the quiet grief began. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the subtle mourning of a self that used to expect reciprocity. A version of me that believed being seen was part of being loved. I didn't announce this realization. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply became aware that I was living inside a definition that no longer fit, and that everyone around me was invested in keeping it that way, including at times me, because stepping out of that role meant introducing uncertainty, discomfort, conversation. And at that point, I was still choosing predictability over truth. But something had shifted. I could feel the edges of the role now, its limits, its cost. And once you see a role clearly, you can't unsee it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment where I suddenly snapped. If you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. That's what makes this part difficult to explain, because the most important changes often look like nothing. It was an ordinary morning. I was standing at this kitchen counter making coffee. The light coming through the window was pale, almost indifferent. He was talking about his day, plans, meetings, frustrations. I listened, as I always did, offering the right responses at the right moments. At some point, he mentioned a decision he'd made that would affect both of us, not dramatically, just casually, as if updating me were the final step, not part of the process. And something in me didn't react the way it used to. There was no tightening in my chest, no impulse to correct, clarify, or negotiate, no internal scramble to make sense of it or make it smoother. I simply noticed the pattern, cleanly, without emotion. It was like seeing a familiar landscape from a distance instead of being inside it. I realized very calmly that this wasn't new, that this had been happening for years, that the difference wasn't his behavior, it was my awareness of it. For the first time, I didn't interpret the moment as a problem to solve. I interpreted it as information. That distinction changed everything. I nodded, I acknowledged what he said, and I went back to my coffee. But internally, something disengaged, not in anger, in clarity. I remember thinking, This is what it looks like when I'm no longer part of the equation. And instead of sadness, I felt a quiet relief, the kind that comes when you stop arguing with reality. Later that day, I replayed the moment, not to analyze it, but to confirm what I'd felt. The absence of urgency, the absence of hope, the absence of that familiar inner voice saying, if you explain it better, things will change. That voice was gone, and without it, the relationship looked different, more factual, less romantic, less confusing. I began noticing how much energy I'd been spending maintaining an illusion of partnership. How many micro adjustments I made daily to compensate for the lack of mutual engagement. How often I filled silence with effort. That day, I didn't confront him. I didn't journal dramatically. I didn't call a friend. I just observed. Over the next few days, I tested the shift quietly. I stopped anticipating needs. I answered questions without elaborating. I let pauses exist without rushing to fill them. Nothing collapsed, and that was the most revealing part. The world didn't end. The relationship didn't implode. What changed was the visibility of the imbalance. Without my constant smoothing, the gaps became obvious, not to him, but to me. I realized I had been acting as the interpreter of the relationship, translating neglect into stress, dismissal into misunderstanding, absence into busyness. Once I stopped translating, the raw material was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a rough patch. It was a structure, and I had been holding it together alone. The shift wasn't a decision to leave. It wasn't even a decision to stop caring. It was a decision to stop correcting the narrative for everyone else, including myself. That morning marked the end of something fundamental, the belief that effort alone could restore balance. From that point on, I no longer asked, how do I fix this? I asked, what is actually happening here? And that question didn't lead to immediate action. It led to silence. But this time, the silence wasn't avoidance. It was a choice. After that morning, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive. Something I used to keep things smooth, to avoid friction, to protect the image of harmony. Now it was deliberate, measured, no longer a reflex, but a decision. I didn't announce the shift. I didn't even fully articulate it to myself at first. I simply stopped volunteering for what wasn't asked for. I stopped compensating for what wasn't offered. I let conversations end where they naturally did. And almost immediately, my silence was misread. It was interpreted as agreement, as contentment. As for me being easy again, that misinterpretation was revealing, because it showed how little my inner world had ever been part of the equation. As long as things functioned externally, my internal state remained irrelevant. I watched this dynamic with a kind of clinical curiosity. I noticed how rarely anyone checked in when I became less expressive, how quickly my reduced engagement was folded into the existing narrative of me as calm, undemanding, and reliable. No one asked what the silence meant. They simply used it. At first, this hurt. Not sharply, but with a dull recognition. The realization that my presence had always been conditional on its convenience. But instead of responding emotionally, I stayed still. I listened more than I spoke. Not in the old way, where listening was a service, but in a detached way, gathering information, observing patterns without intervening. I noticed how decisions continued to be made without consultation. How my reduced availability created minor inconveniences that others quietly resented but never addressed directly. How my absence from emotional labor left gaps no one knew how to fill. And still, no one asked why. That told me everything I needed to know. Silence, when chosen consciously, creates space. And in that space, truths surface without confrontation. I began documenting, not obsessively but clearly, dates, decisions, conversations. Not to build a case, but to ground myself in reality, to prevent the slow gaslighting of self-doubt from creeping back in. Because when you stop reacting, people often fill the quiet with their assumptions. They assumed I was fine. They assumed I agreed. They assumed I would adjust, eventually. And I let them, not out of passivity, but because correcting those assumptions no longer felt necessary. I wasn't trying to be understood anymore. I was trying to be accurate, with myself. This period wasn't empowering in a cinematic way. It was lonely, disorienting. There were moments when I wondered if I was overinterpreting everything. Maybe this was just another phase, and I was making it heavier than it needed to be. But then there were moments of undeniable clarity, like realizing how little changed when I stopped trying, how little effort was made to re-engage me, how silence, once it stopped being filled by my labor, simply remained. That's when I understood something crucial. My voice had been carrying more weight than anyone realized. And once it withdrew, the imbalance became structural, not emotional. I wasn't being punished. I was being bypassed. And the bypass was smooth. I didn't confront it, because confrontation requires a shared investment in resolution. What I was seeing didn't suggest that investment existed anymore, so I stayed quiet, but not small. Internally, I was steady, observant, grounded in what was happening rather than what I wished were happening. Silence became my way of stepping out of the role without triggering an alarm, of reclaiming agency without spectacle, of allowing reality to present itself without interference. Others mistook this for weakness. They thought I was retreating. What they didn't see was that I was finally standing somewhere solid, inside myself. And from that place, preparation began. What no one noticed, because they were used to my quiet, was that I had become very active internally. Silence freed up space. And in that space, I began doing what I had always done best: observing, organizing, and preparing. Not emotionally, but practically, methodically, without drama. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to leave. That's a myth people like because it makes endings feel sudden and clean. What actually happened was slower, more deliberate. I started paying attention to details I had previously glossed over in the name of harmony. Financial rhythms, patterns of decision-making. Who carried the risk? Who benefited from flexibility? I noticed how often my labor, emotional, logistical, temporal, absorbed instability that would otherwise have been visible. How many systems worked only because I was compensating for their imbalance. So I stopped compensating. Instead, I documented, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for reality. I needed to know what was actually true, not what I had been smoothing over. I reviewed shared accounts. I clarified timelines. I saved messages. I noted dates when decisions were made unilaterally. I kept everything factual, neutral, almost boring. That neutrality was important because it kept me from slipping into narrative, from turning this into a story about villains and victims. This wasn't about punishment. It was about accuracy. At the same time, I began learning, quietly. I read about financial separation, not because I had decided on divorce, but because I wanted to understand dependency. I researched legal frameworks, not to prepare a case, but to understand my position. Knowledge, I realized, was a form of stability I had been outsourcing for too long. None of this changed my behavior outwardly. I still showed up, still handled what was clearly mine to handle, still engaged when engaged with. I simply stopped overfunctioning. And that shift went completely unnoticed, because people don't notice when you stop doing invisible work. They only notice when it's gone, and even then they often don't know what's missing. I also began reclaiming small pieces of myself. Time alone, money that stayed in my control, decisions that required no consensus. Not in rebellion, in alignment. I stopped explaining myself unnecessarily. I stopped narrating my inner world. I stopped offering reassurance for things that hadn't been asked about. The more I did this, the clearer things became. Not externally, but internally. I could see, with uncomfortable precision, how one-sided the emotional architecture of the relationship had become. How much of our stability relied on my willingness to absorb discomfort without acknowledgement. And here's what surprised me most. No one reacted. There was no confrontation, no curiosity, no sudden effort to reconnect. My quiet withdrawal didn't register as a loss, because my full presence had never been required. That realization hurt, but it also clarified, because it meant I was no longer obligated to preserve something that only existed through my effort. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't manipulating. I wasn't playing a game. I was preparing for adulthood in its truest form, informed, grounded, unsentimental. The documentation wasn't about leverage yet. It was about orientation, about making sure that when I eventually moved, I wasn't doing so from confusion or impulse. I needed to know the terrain, and slowly, piece by piece, it came into focus. The relationship wasn't broken, it was complete, just without me at its center. Once I saw that, there was no urgency, only a quiet sense of inevitability. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like a rebellion. It looked calm. It looked like compliance. It looked like me. But underneath that familiar exterior, something irreversible was forming. Not anger, readiness. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. There was no moment where I gasped, no dramatic discovery that flipped everything upside down. What came instead was quieter and far more destabilizing in its own way. It was the moment when everything I had been documenting, noticing, and learning aligned into a single, unmistakable truth. I had leverage, not in the way people usually mean that word. Not something sinister or explosive. No secrets, no scandals, no hidden betrayals waiting to be exposed. What I had was clarity. I understood the structure of our life together better than anyone else did, including him. I understood how decisions were being made, how resources flowed, how responsibility was distributed, and most importantly, how much of the system relied on my continued participation. That was the reveal. I wasn't trapped. I had simply been anchoring something that no longer anchored me. Once that realization settled, it didn't produce excitement. It produced stillness, the kind that follows when a long internal argument finally ends. I saw with uncomfortable precision that if I stopped holding things together, they wouldn't immediately collapse, but they would reconfigure in ways that exposed the imbalance I had been shielding everyone from. I also saw that my position was stronger than I had assumed. Legally, financially, logistically. Not because I had planned it that way, but because I had been careful for years. Without calling it a strategy, I had maintained records. I had preserved autonomy in subtle ways. I had avoided entanglements that would have required me to surrender control for the sake of ease. At the time, I thought I was being prudent. Now I understood I had been protecting myself instinctively. That realization came with grief, not for the marriage, but for how little trust I had placed in my own perception for so long. How often I had discounted my discomfort because it didn't arrive dramatically enough to justify action. I sat with that grief privately. I didn't share it. I didn't announce my clarity. I didn't let it sharpen my tone or change my demeanor, because clarity doesn't need to be proven. It only needs to be honored. I remember sitting alone one evening, reviewing notes I had taken over months. Dates, decisions, patterns, everything lined up cleanly. There were no contradictions, no excuses left standing. And for the first time, I didn't ask myself if things could change. I asked myself whether I would accept them if they didn't. That was the real reveal. Not what I could do, but what I was no longer willing to tolerate. There was no satisfaction in this knowledge, no sense of winning, just a calm understanding that the emotional contract I thought we shared had expired long ago, and only I had kept renewing it, silently, automatically, alone. I didn't confront him with this clarity, not because I was afraid, but because clarity doesn't argue. It observes. It waits. I needed to see what would happen if I held this knowledge quietly, if I stopped hoping it would be proven wrong, if I let reality behave as it always had, without my intervention. And reality did not disappoint. Nothing changed. No sudden awareness, no new effort, no recognition of distance. And in that unchanged landscape, my decision began forming, not emotionally but structurally, piece by piece, without urgency. The private reveal wasn't a turning point anyone else could see, but for me, it was definitive. It marked the end of uncertainty. From that point on, I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was choosing alignment. And once you cross that internal threshold, there is no going back to hoping, only forward to deciding. The decision didn't arrive with urgency. That surprised me. I had always assumed that if I ever reached a breaking point, it would feel sharp, dramatic, undeniable. Instead, what I felt was measured, calm, almost procedural. That was how I knew it was real. Once the private reveal settled, I found myself standing at a quiet crossroads. There were multiple paths forward, and for the first time I saw them clearly, without emotional fog. I could stay. I could continue as I was, armed now with awareness instead of hope. I could accept the role fully, stop expecting reciprocity, and live a life built on competence and self-containment. Many people do this. They build parallel inner lives. They redefine marriage as logistics and companionship, not encounter. That path was viable. I could also confront. I could lay everything out. Patterns, imbalance, quiet erosion. I could ask for recognition, for repair, for a restructuring of how we relate. There was a version of this path that included counseling, long conversations, and careful promises. That path too was possible. And then there was the third option, the one that didn't involve negotiation, the one that acknowledged something uncomfortable but undeniable. That effort, when it arrives only after withdrawal, isn't repair. It's reaction. And that any change produced by the threat of loss would never give me back what I had already lost. Presence. I spent weeks at this decision point, not agonizing, evaluating. I asked myself hard questions, honestly, without romance. If nothing changed, could I live this way without resentment? If things did change, would I trust the change, or always wonder how long it would last? If I stayed, would I still be myself in 10 years, or just a more efficient version of who I had already become? Each question led me to the same quiet answer. I wasn't angry enough to fight, and I wasn't broken enough to beg. That realization mattered. because it meant my choice wouldn't be fueled by emotion, it would be grounded in self-respect. I also understood something else at that decision point. Time and if I confronted him before I was ready to act, I would be pulled back into explanation, negotiation, and reassurance. NCE. I would be tempted to soften my clarity for the sake of comfort. So I waited, not to punish, to protect my own resolve. I let the days continue as they were. I watched how easily things stayed the same, how little curiosity existed about my inner world, how natural it felt for him to occupy the center while I orbited quietly. That observation answered my remaining doubts. The decision, when it finally crystallized, was almost anticlimactic. I would leave, not in chaos, not in anger, not with demands, but with preparation. I would choose the irreversible option, not because I wanted to end the marriage, but because I refused to continue a version of life where my presence was optional. That choice didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel aligned. There's a difference. Power seeks control over others. Alignment seeks integrity within oneself. Once I chose alignment, everything else became logistical. The emotional work had already been done. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't seek validation. I didn't rehearse speeches. I simply acknowledged, internally, that the path forward no longer included waiting. And that acknowledgement changed how I moved through the world. I became quieter but steadier, more neutral but more resolved. The decision point wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself, but it closed every door behind me without slamming a single one. From that moment on, I was no longer considering possibilities. I was preparing for execution. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not because I hesitated, but because there was no need to rush. Urgency would have introduced noise, and noise would have invited negotiation, questions, and emotional spirals. I wasn't trying to provoke change anymore. I was trying to move cleanly. So I moved in silence. This wasn't secrecy in a deceptive sense. It was privacy, the kind that allows you to act without having to defend your clarity to people who aren't ready to understand it. I began separating my life in small, deliberate ways. Accounts that were already in my name stayed there. I redirected income quietly. I updated passwords, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. I reviewed documents, made copies, and ensured access. Everything was methodical, boring even. That was intentional. I wanted each step to feel ordinary, unemotional, just another adult task being completed thoroughly. I consulted professionals discreetly, asked neutral questions, took notes. I didn't frame my situation as dramatic or urgent because it wasn't. It was simply precise. The more I prepared, the more grounded I felt. Not excited, not relieved, grounded. What surprised me was how invisible this movement remained. Life continued as usual. Conversations stayed surface level. Routines held. He didn't sense a shift, not because I was hiding it well, but because the relationship had long stopped registering my inner movements as significant. That realization didn't hurt anymore. It clarified. I also began disentangling emotionally in subtle ways. I stopped sharing my inner deliberations. I stopped seeking validation or comfort. I stopped shaping my tone to maintain equilibrium. None of this caused conflict, because conflict requires friction. And I had already stepped out of the space where friction could occur. In some ways, this was the loneliest part. Moving through shared spaces with a private sense of finality, knowing that the ending had already happened internally, while externally everything looked unchanged. But loneliness at this stage felt different. It wasn't abandonment, it was autonomy. I noticed how calm I was, how little I needed reassurance, how my sense of self no longer hinged on whether I was understood. That calm wasn't indifference. It was containment of myself for myself. I didn't rehearse conversations. I didn't imagine outcomes. I trusted the preparation, trusted that when the time came, I wouldn't need to convince anyone of anything. Because I wasn't asking for permission, I was executing a decision. The silence protected me from doubt, from being pulled back into explaining feelings that no longer needed explanation, from the temptation to soften reality to make it more palatable. Moving in silence allowed the process to stay clean. No ultimatums, no emotional bargaining, no dramatic reveals, just alignment unfolding quietly. At times, I wondered if he sensed something, if there were moments of intuition I couldn't see. But if there were, they didn't translate into action. And that too told me what I needed to know. Because when people feel a real shift, they respond, unless they've grown accustomed to absence. I wasn't punishing him by staying silent. I was honoring myself by staying focused. The preparations reached a point of completion before anything external changed. I knew where I stood. I knew what I could support independently. I knew what I was no longer willing to subsidize. emotionally or practically. By the time I was ready to speak, the outcome was no longer negotiable. Not because I had closed my heart, but because I had finally opened my eyes. Moving in silence wasn't about disappearing. It was about arriving fully, firmly at the truth. The consequences didn't arrive with my announcement. They began earlier, quietly, unevenly, while no one was naming them yet. Once I stopped compensating, small fractures appeared. Not dramatic ones, just inconveniences, delays, awkward pauses where something used to flow effortlessly. At first, these were dismissed. A missed detail here, a miscommunication there. Nothing alarming enough to demand attention. Just enough to create mild irritation, directed outward, never inward. I watched this with a kind of detached awareness. I saw how responsibilities I used to absorb began landing where they had always belonged. How emotional gaps I used to bridge remained open. How assumptions that once worked smoothly now lead to confusion. And still no one connected this to me. That was the strangest part. My absence was felt, but not attributed. People sensed loss without understanding its source. He became more unsettled, not dramatically, but subtly, less certain, more reactive to minor disruptions. He didn't become cruel or panicked. He became confused. And confusion often looks like irritation. I noticed how the conversation's tone shifted slightly, how patience thinned, how frustration surfaced over things that had once resolved themselves quietly. I was no longer doing that resolving, and the system didn't know how to correct for it. There were moments when he seemed almost to reach for me, asking questions that brushed the edges of concern, but they never crossed into inquiry, never into why. It was as if acknowledging the depth of change would require acknowledging my centrality, and that had never been part of the framework. So instead, the discomfort was externalized. Stress, work, timing, circumstances, anything but the dynamic itself. I didn't point it out. I didn't take satisfaction in watching things wobble. There was no sense of, now you'll see. If anything, I felt a quiet sadness. Not because things were unraveling, but because they were unraveling without anyone noticing what had been holding them together. That realization confirmed what I already knew. The marriage hadn't been sustained by mutual presence. It had been sustained by my participation. Once that participation became measured instead of automatic, the imbalance surfaced. I also noticed something else during this phase. I was calmer than everyone else. While others reacted to small disruptions, I felt steady, detached, but not cold, prepared. The emotional labor had already been done internally. The grief had already been processed. What remained was execution. The consequences continued to accumulate, not as punishment, but as a natural outcome. Decisions took longer. Emotional misattunements lingered. Support structures felt thinner. Not because I withdrew care, but because care had always flowed disproportionately through me. I could see how disorienting this was for him. From his perspective, nothing big had changed, yet things felt harder, less coordinated, less forgiving. And without a clear cause, the discomfort turned inward and outward in unhelpful ways. But still, no recognition, and I understood why. Recognizing it would mean recognizing me, not as a role, not as a stabilizer, but as a person whose presence mattered structurally. That realization came too late. By the time the consequences were noticeable enough to create concern, my internal decision had already solidified. The shift had already passed the point of reversal. This phase wasn't about revenge or validation. It was about witnessing the natural results of stepping out of a system that depended on unacknowledged labor. And once those results begin, they don't announce themselves as consequences. They simply feel like a loss, unexplained, uncomfortable, irretrievable. By the time the concern became visible, it had already missed its moment. That's the part people misunderstand most about endings like this. They imagine a window where recognition automatically leads to repair, where noticing damage means it can still be undone. But timing matters, and recognition that arrives after disengagement isn't repair, it's a response to loss. I began to sense the shift in him before he named it. A restlessness, a sudden attentiveness that felt slightly out of sync, like someone arriving at a conversation that had already ended. He asked more questions, checked in more often, not deeply, but noticeably more than before. From the outside, it might have looked like an effort. From the inside, it felt like an interruption, because the questions weren't rooted in curiosity, they were rooted in unease, in the discomfort of something no longer working as it used to. I could feel the recalibration happening too late. He didn't say, "I see you differently now." He said things like, "You seem distant, you've been quiet lately, is everything okay?" Those questions mattered, but not in the way he intended. They revealed that my presence had only become noticeable in its absence. And absence is a terrible place to begin repair. I answered calmly, honestly, but minimally. I didn't accuse. I didn't unload years of Conti. I responded in the present tense, not a historical summary, Ari, because I wasn't trying to convince him of anything. I was observing how he responded to the new reality. What I saw was panic, not dramatic, but subtle. A desire to restore comfort rather than address the cause. A focus on symptoms rather than structure. He wanted things to feel normal again. I wanted things to be true. Those two goals are no longer aligned. There were moments when I almost felt sorry for him, not in a superior way, but in a human one. Watching someone realize, too late, that they had misunderstood the nature of their stability. But sympathy doesn't reverse erosion, and it doesn't restore trust. I had already crossed the threshold where effort, no matter how sincere, felt misplaced. Because it wasn't emerging from awareness, it was emerging from disruption. And disruption centers the person who is losing comfort, not the one who has been losing presence for years. That distinction mattered to me. He asked if something had changed. I didn't say yes. I said, I've been paying attention. That answer unsettled him, because attention reveals things that reassurance can't fix. I could see him reaching for solutions, conversations, plans, gestures that might have worked years earlier. But now, they landed flat. Not because they were insincere, but because they were late. They didn't address what had already ended, the belief that my presence was guaranteed, the belief that I would continue to adjust, the belief that I would always make room. By the time he wanted to talk about us, I had already grieved us. Privately, thoroughly, without spectacle. There was no satisfaction in this. Only a steady awareness that repair requires timing, not just intention. And the intention that arrives after loss often mistakes urgency for depth. I didn't shut him down. I simply didn't re-enter. And that was the moment when the imbalance became undeniable. Not because I declared it, but because I no longer cushioned it. Too late doesn't mean impossible in every story, but in this one, it meant the foundation had already shifted. And no amount of late attention could make it feel like recognition instead of reaction. When the confrontation finally happened, it didn't feel like a collision. It felt like alignment catching up with reality. There was no dramatic setup, no raised voices, no rehearsed speech. We were sitting across from each other in a familiar space, the kind of space where countless conversations had already happened, most of them shaped by my restraint. This one was different, not because I was louder, because I was finished explaining myself. He asked what was going on. Not defensively, not aggressive, just plain, Ellie. There was confusion in his voice, and something else too, an awareness that whatever answer he received would matter more than the question itself. I didn't start from the beginning. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount moments. I didn't bring evidence. I spoke from the present. I told him that I no longer felt partnered, that I had spent a long time adjusting to that reality quietly, that I wasn't angry, but I was done pretending that effort alone could replace presence. He tried to interrupt, not to argue, but to contextualize, to explain intentio, to soften the impact. Act. I let him finish. Then I said something that surprised both of us. I told him that intentions were no longer relevant to me, that what mattered was the structure we had been living in, and how long I had been alone inside it. There was a pause after that, a real one. He asked why I hadn't said something sooner, and for the first time, I didn't translate my answer to protect him. I said, I did, just not loudly enough for it to feel urgent to you. That landed, not as an accusation, as truth. He tried to move into repair mode, asked what I needed, what could change, what he could do differently. I listened. And then I told him the part that ended the conversation, not dramatically, but definitively. I said that I had already changed, that the version of me who was waiting to be met no longer existed, that I wasn't asking him to become someone else, but I was no longer willing to be who I had been. There was no shouting, no collapse, just the slow realization that the ground had shifted without notice. He looked at me like someone trying to recognize a familiar place that no longer matched the map in their head. And I understood that look. I had been holding that confusion for years. I told him I wanted to separate, not as a threat, not as leverage, as a statement of fact. He asked if I was sure. I didn't answer immediately, not to dramatize, but because certainty doesn't rush. Then I said yes. What followed wasn't explosive, it was quiet, heavy, final. There were questions I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because they belonged to a version of the relationship that no longer existed. Explanations wouldn't resurrect it. Rehashing wouldn't restore trust. The confrontation didn't end in resolution. It ended in clarity, for both of us, though only one of us had been living with it already. When it was over, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not grief, just steadiness. The kind that comes when you stop arguing with yourself. I didn't walk away triumphant. I walked away intact. And that mattered more than being understood in that moment. After everything was said, life didn't suddenly feel lighter. It felt quieter. Not empty, just no longer crowded with internal negotiations. No longer filled with the low-level tension of managing imbalance. The silence I moved into wasn't the same silence I had lived with before. This one belonged to me. Who I am now isn't a reinventee. It's a return, though not to who I was before the marriage. Age, to someone more accurate. I'm still calm, still observant, still but those qualities no longer exist in the service of being palatable or easy AC. They exist because they are part of me, not because they make others comfortable. I no longer translate my experience to make it digestible. I no longer soften truths to avoid inconvenience. I no longer confuse endurance with love. That shift shows up in small, ordinary ways. I ask questions and wait for real answers. I state preferences without apologizing for them. I notice when effort is reciprocal and when it isn't, and I respond accordingly. There's no bitterness in this. That surprises people. They expect anger or defensiveness or long explanations. But what I feel most often is clarity. Clarity has a cooling effect. It burns off resentment by removing confusion. I don't tell this story to position myself as strong in contrast to someone else's weakness. Strength isn't comparative, it's contextual. I became strong because I stopped denying what I was experiencing. I also don't see my past self as foolish. She was attentive, loyal, hopeful. She believed in repair. That belief wasn't wrong, it was just unshared. Now I believe in alignment, in choosing spaces where presence is mutual, not extracted. Where care doesn't require constant self-erasure. Where silence isn't mistaken for consent. I'm more selective now, not guarded, but discerning. I trust my internal signals earlier. I don't wait for proof to honor discomfort. I don't need situations to become unbearable before I acknowledge they're misaligned. That's what changed. Not my capacity for love, but my tolerance for imbalance. I still believe in commitment, in depth, in a long-term effort. But I also believe that love without recognition isn't noble. It's unsustainable. And I no longer build my life around being sustainable for others at the expense of myself. There are days when I think about the marriage, not with regret, but with understanding. I can see how easily it became what it was. How roles solidify when they go unexamined. How quiet people are often mistaken for content ones. That awareness doesn't harden me, it sharpens me. I move through the world now with less explanation and more intention. I don't rush intimacy. I don't perform stability. I let things reveal themselves. And when something doesn't meet me where I am, I don't negotiate myself downward to meet it. I step away. That's not dominance. That's self-respect. And it's the quietest, most durable form of strength I've ever known. There's a particular kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending at all. No explosion, no villain, no moment where everyone agrees on what went wrong. Just the slow, undeniable realization that something essential has already been missing, and that you've been the only one trying to replace it. For a long time, I believed that staying quiet was a form of kindness, that absorbing imbalance was maturity, that if I just explained myself better, waited longer, loved harder, things would eventually feel mutual again. But here's the truth I learned, slowly and without drama. Love that requires you to disappear is not love that will sustain you. This story isn't about leaving a marriage. It's about recognizing when effort becomes substitution, when patience becomes erasure, when being understanding starts costing you your voice. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I finally cared enough about myself to stop pretending that being unseen was acceptable. And I want to be very clear about something. This isn't a call to walk away at the first sign of discomfort. Relationships require work. They require communication, humility, and grace. But they also require presence, not occasional attention, not a reactive effort, not concern that only appears when silence becomes inconvenient. Presence, if you're the only one adjusting, explaining, accommodating, and waiting, something isn't broken. It's already decided. I realized my marriage ended long before the divorce because the partnership had quietly dissolved while the structure remained. Because I was the only one still trying to translate absence into something workable. And once I stopped doing that, the truth had nowhere left to hide. There is no triumph in this story, only clarity. And clarity doesn't ask to be applauded, it asks to be honored. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, not in the details, but in the feeling, I want you to know something. You're not weak for staying, you're not foolish for hoping, and you're not cruel for choosing yourself when hope stops being shared. Quiet people often leave quietly, not because they don't care, but because they've already said everything that mattered. So I'll leave you with one question, not to provoke, not to push, just to invite reflection. In your life, is there a place where you're still trying to keep something alive? Has that already stopped meeting you there? If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments.